It was just another routine traffic stop, or so Officer Daniels thought. He didn't expect that the young black woman he pulled over would end up being the one person who could destroy his career in one moment. When he slapped her across the face, his heart raced, thinking he could get away with it. But then the woman revealed who she really was, and everything changed. What happened next? Let's just say the consequences were far worse than he could have ever imagined. Before we dive in, let us know in the comment, where are you watching from? It was a typical day in the city, the kind of day where nothing out of the ordinary seemed to happen. Lena Johnson was running errands, just like anyone else. But as she made her way down the street, she had no idea that this simple trip would be the moment that would change everything. Lena was the chief of police, a powerful woman who had earned her position through years of hard work. She wasn't just respected by her colleagues, but admired by the community for her fair approach to law enforcement. But beyond her badge, she was a mother and a sister, someone who had dealt with the struggles of life like anyone else. She had seen the way the system worked and how broken it could be. But that day, Lena wasn't thinking about that. She was just another person running errands, blending in with the crowd. Enter Officer Ben Roberts. New to the force, Ben had built a reputation for being tough and no-nonsense. But what no one saw was the prejudice that ran deep within him. Growing up in a neighborhood where diversity was rare, he carried his biases with him into his role as an officer. It wasn't just the way he looked at people. It was how he assumed things about them, how he judged them based on their appearance. And when he saw Lena that day, all he saw was another black woman. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the woman he was about to stop was the one person who could completely change his life. It started as just another traffic stop. But something about the way Lena spoke, the way she carried herself, must have irritated Roberts. His suspicions grew, and before long, his assumptions turned into something more dangerous. What should have been a quick stop spiraled into something that neither of them was prepared for. And that's when everything changed. Lena was behind the wheel, waiting for the light to turn green when Officer Ben Roberts pulled up behind her. At first, it seemed like just another routine stop. No big deal, just a minor traffic violation. But something about Roberts's demeanor immediately felt off. When he approached her car, his words were sharp and dismissive. "What do you think you're doing, running a red light like that?" he asked, his tone full of judgment. Lena, calm and composed as ever, simply responded, "I didn't run the light, officer. I was just waiting for it to change." But Roberts wasn't having it. His eyes narrowed, and instead of letting it go, he pressed on. "You're lying," he snapped. "Don't think I didn't see you." The intensity in his voice wasn't just about the violation. There was something else, something underlying that made Lena feel uncomfortable. She could tell by the way he looked at her that it wasn't about the light at all. He was angry, and that anger was directed at her. Lena took a deep breath. She didn't want to escalate things, especially not in public, but she had to defend herself. "I'm telling you, officer, I didn't run the light," she repeated, keeping her voice steady. "Please, I'd appreciate it if you could just let me go." But Roberts wasn't ready to let this go. As the interaction continued, his attitude got worse. He began to question her more aggressively, asking things she didn't have to answer. "What are you doing out this hour?" he demanded. "Where are you going? And why don't you respect authority?" Lena felt irritation rise, but she still didn't want to escalate things further. She knew that the moment you lose your cool, it was easy for everything to spiral. But Roberts had already made up his mind about her. To him, she was just another person who didn't respect authority, someone beneath him. His prejudices were clear, and it wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. Her patience was being tested, but she stayed calm. "I'm just trying to get home," she said, trying to remain neutral. "Please, just let me go." But then, without warning, the situation took a dramatic turn. Roberts took a step closer to her car. "You're not going anywhere until I get some respect," he spat. And before she could process what was happening, Roberts raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The suddenness of it took her by surprise, her cheek stinging from the impact. For a brief moment, Lena was frozen. The slap wasn't just physical. It was a slap to her dignity, to the respect she had earned, and to everything she had worked for. The room was silent for a moment as she sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her emotions building. But she wasn't just reacting to being slapped. This wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the hate that had been buried beneath Roberts's arrogance. His racism had shown itself clearly, and now there was no ignoring it. Her mind raced. Was this really happening? Was he really going to get away with it? Her hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but she held herself back, not wanting to make things worse. Could she get away without escalating things further, or was this going to turn into something much bigger than she had anticipated? Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Lena's heart was still racing, but she knew she had to stay composed. She couldn't let this go unnoticed. Then, with the weight of the moment settling in, Lena took a deep breath. She met Roberts's gaze, and the look in her eyes was icy, filled with calm fury. She opened her jacket, slowly, deliberately, and reached for her badge. "You don't know who you've just slapped," Lena said quietly, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving Roberts's stunned face. She pulled the badge from her jacket, holding it up so that he could clearly see it. "I'm the chief of police." Roberts's eyes went wide in shock. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His entire body stiffened, and he took a step back, looking at Lena as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. For a brief moment, the weight of his mistake crushed him. He had no idea who he had just disrespected. He had no idea that the woman he had slapped wasn't just another driver on the road, but the most powerful person in the room. His arrogance, his prejudices, had clouded his judgment in the worst possible way. Roberts stood there, frozen, his face draining of color. The shock of realizing who he had just slapped hit him like a freight train. His body stiffened as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. Lena Johnson, the woman he had treated so badly, wasn't just another person on the street. She wasn't just some random black woman he could push around. She was the chief of police, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the city. And now he had slapped her in front of everyone. His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do to undo what had just happened. His arrogance and prejudice had made him blind to the consequences of his actions, and now it was too late. Lena stood still, calm on the outside. But inside, the anger was boiling. How could he, another officer, someone she should have been able to trust, treat her like this? How could he slap someone who was part of the very system he was supposed to uphold? Lena's eyes remained fixed on Roberts, unwavering. The silence in the air was thick, suffocating. The tension was palpable. The other officers who had been standing by, watching the exchange, now slowly turned their attention to Roberts. One by one, they began questioning him, but Roberts could barely form words. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake, and now he couldn't take it back. "I didn't know," Roberts stammered, trying to defend himself, but it was no use. His voice trembled, and he looked as if he had just seen his entire career crumble in front of his eyes. He could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him, the shock and disbelief coming from his fellow officers. He tried to apologize, but it didn't matter anymore. Lena stepped forward, her voice steady, but filled with a power that only someone who had worked her entire life to get where she was could command. "You don't get to slap anyone," she said, her words cutting through the silence, "let alone another officer. Especially not me." Her words hung in the air, leaving no room for argument. The truth was clear. Roberts had crossed a line, and there was no excuse for it. The officers around them shifted, their gazes now turning from Roberts to Lena, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a personal issue. It was a matter of respect, of authority, and of the system itself. And Roberts had failed on every count. Lena's internal struggle was fierce. As the chief of police, she had seen her fair share of corruption, injustice, and abuse of power. But this was different. This wasn't just a case of misconduct in the department. It was personal. As a woman, Lena knew what it was like to be disrespected, to be treated as less than. As a mother, she understood the instinct to protect herself and her loved ones. But as the chief, she had to set the standard for everyone, no exceptions. Roberts had crossed the line, and now he would have to face the consequences. The silence between them was deafening. Lena's calmness contrasted sharply with Roberts's fear and regret. She knew the importance of this moment, not just for her, but for the entire department. She had to show everyone that no one, regardless of their position or their biases, was above the law, that respect and dignity were not negotiable. Roberts, still in shock, opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But Lena wasn't interested in apologies. She had heard enough empty words from people like him. What mattered now was accountability. What mattered was justice. And justice was something Roberts would get, whether he liked it or not. Lena's gaze didn't waver. She knew that this was bigger than just one officer. This wasn't just about him. It was about setting a precedent. It was about showing the rest of the department that no one was above the law, that the system would hold everyone accountable, even those who thought they were untouchable. "I'm not here for apologies," Lena said, her voice cold, but her resolve unshaken. "You will face the consequences of your actions, and trust me, it will be far more than just an apology." Roberts's face paled as the weight of his mistake settled in. He had underestimated her, and now he was about to feel the full force of the consequences. The officers around them watched in silence, knowing that this was a turning point, not just for Roberts, but for the department as a whole. Lena turned away from Roberts, her expression resolute. She knew that this wasn't over yet. There would be investigations, repercussions, and a reckoning. But in this moment, she had made it clear that no one would get away with disrespecting her or anyone else in the department, no matter their rank or position. The rest of the room stood still as Lena's words echoed in their minds. She had spoken truth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged. And Roberts, standing there with his apologies and regret, realized too late that this was a battle he couldn't win. Lena stood there, her eyes locked onto Roberts, as the realization hit her like a heavy wave. This wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It wasn't about one moment of aggression that could be dismissed or overlooked. This was much bigger. This was a symptom of something far more pervasive, something deeply embedded in the very structure of the system she had spent her life trying to serve. Systemic racism was not just an occasional mistake. It was a constant, a part of the culture that had poisoned law enforcement for far too long. The slap from Roberts had been the tipping point, but what it had revealed underneath was something that Lena could no longer ignore. She had known it for years, had seen the way some officers treated civilians, especially black people. But it hadn't fully hit her until now. Her stomach twisted as she thought about all the instances that had gone unchecked. All the times when authority had been misused, all the complaints ignored, and all the systems that had allowed officers like Roberts to thrive unchecked. This wasn't just one bad apple. This was a whole orchard that needed to be addressed. Lena's gaze didn't falter. The room was filled with silence, and as the weight of the moment bore down on her, she knew that this wasn't just about retaliation or personal revenge. It was about confronting a reality that had been allowed to fester for far too long. As the chief of police, Lena had the power to make changes. She had the responsibility to set things right. And if she didn't start here, if she didn't use her position to address this, nothing would ever change. As Lena's thoughts raced, she could feel the simmering anger inside her. It wasn't the slap, it wasn't the disrespect, and it wasn't even Roberts himself. It was the larger picture that needed fixing. She could see it now, clearer than ever. This wasn't just an isolated incident, a one-off mistake made by a single bad officer. This was part of a bigger issue that ran deep through the system. A system that, for too long, had allowed people like Roberts to go unchecked, to act with impunity. And now, Lena had the chance to put an end to it. But it wasn't going to be easy. Lena didn't need an apology from Roberts. She didn't need him to beg for forgiveness. What she needed was action. What the entire department needed was accountability. There had to be a change, and that change had to start with her. She was no longer just a woman trying to keep the peace. She was the head of the department, and if she didn't step up, if she didn't address this, then what was the point of everything she had worked for? Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? Lena's voice was steady, but filled with a quiet fury. Roberts stood in front of her, trembling, unable to form coherent words. He had no idea that the woman he had disrespected wasn't just any woman. She was the chief of police, and she was about to make sure that he would never make the same mistake again. Lena's heart beat faster, but it wasn't from fear or anger. It was from the realization that this moment was hers to control. This moment was where change could start. She was standing on the edge of a decision that could alter the future of law enforcement in her town, a decision that could send ripples throughout the entire police department and beyond. If she backed down now, if she let this moment pass, she would be complicit in the system that allowed officers like Roberts to act with such blatant disregard for justice. And she wouldn't be that person. "I'm not just going to let this go," Lena continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "This is bigger than you, Roberts. This is about the entire department. This is about the culture that needs to change. You crossed a line today, and you're going to answer for it. But it's not just you. It's the system you're a part of." Roberts's face twisted with confusion and fear. He had never expected this. In his mind, he had always been in control. He had always believed that his position, his uniform, his reputation could shield him from consequences. But now, in the face of the woman standing before him, he realized he was wrong. He was about to be held accountable, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. Lena's internal struggle wasn't about her career. She had already proven herself in the field. It wasn't about her pride either. This wasn't personal. It was about the larger fight for justice, a fight that she had to take on for the sake of everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been mistreated, and everyone who would come after them. This was about making a stand for the truth, and she couldn't let the system keep perpetuating this kind of behavior. The moment stretched on, and Lena's resolve grew stronger. She could feel her emotions pushing her forward. This was bigger than a slap. This was bigger than one officer's prejudice. This was about the future of the department and the community she had sworn to serve. If she didn't stand up to Roberts, if she didn't hold him accountable, then no one would ever be safe from the deep-rooted racism in law enforcement. "I won't let this go," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "You'll face the consequences. And this is just the beginning. This is where it changes." As Lena took the first step toward holding Roberts accountable, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The fight for justice, for real change, would take time. But in this moment, she had made the first move. She had put her foot down, and there was no turning back. The department had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger, a movement for change that would echo far beyond this one incident. Roberts, now realizing the full scope of his mistake, had no idea what was coming next. Lena had set the wheels of change in motion, and nothing would stop it. In the end, this wasn't just about the slap. It was about confronting the larger issue of racism within law enforcement. Lena had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced for far too long. For every person who had suffered in silence, fearing that speaking out would only make things worse. Lena knew that this moment was just the beginning. Real change wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't come easily, but it had to start somewhere. And this was as good a place as any. Her decision to hold Officer Roberts accountable had opened a door that would hopefully lead to an investigation, a reevaluation of policies, and eventually a department where officers could no longer act with impunity, where their prejudices would be confronted head-on. Lena understood that this battle wasn't just hers. It was for the countless others who had experienced what she did, who had been treated unfairly, who had been oppressed because of the color of their skin. The road ahead would be difficult, and she knew she'd face pushback from those who preferred the status quo. But she couldn't afford to stop now. The system had failed too many for too long, and Lena was determined to be part of the change, even if it meant challenging everything she had worked for. What do you think needs to be done to address systemic racism in law enforcement? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's continue this conversation about justice and equality. More stories challenging the status quo are coming your way, so stay tuned and don't miss the next one. Together, we can make a difference.